My name is Ethan, and I have always been drawn to the darkness, its mysteries, its horrors, and the secrets it keeps from ordinary people. But even I was unprepared for what happened that night. The night when something unholy slithered into my reality, into my very bones. It started when my family and I visited my aunt's house. Her place had always felt a little strange, a little too still, but we never questioned it. That night, however, the air was thick with something unseen, something watching. We all sensed it, though no one dared to say a word. The unease clawed at my stomach, and after dinner, an unbearable pain twisted inside me. We laughed it off, blaming my aunt's questionable cooking, but I knew. I knew it was something else. We all decided to sleep in one room, a habit my mother insisted on when staying over at relatives' places. A way to keep the family close, safe. I didn't argue. I let the darkness swallow me as I drifted into restless sleep. Until I woke up. Sweat drenched my skin, my stomach a pit of agony. My head spun, my vision swam, and then I saw it. A shape shifting in the shadows, lurking just beyond the veil of the night. At first, my muddled brain dismissed it as a heap of discarded clothes, but clarity was a cruel gift. It was not clothes. It was alive. A figure stood there, small and hunched, clad in tattered black. Its skin, if that grotesque surface could be called skin, was so pale it seemed to drink in the darkness around it. And its face, its absence of a face. No eyes, no mouth, nothing but a smooth, elongated stretch of flesh where its features should have been. It was inhuman, unnatural. Long strands of ink-black hair draped over its skeletal form, but two strands floated, writhing like the tendrils of some unseen force. My breath caught in my throat. My limbs refused to move. A cold terror wrapped around me like chains. I tried to scream. I forced my mouth open, my lips forming the word, but my voice barely escaped. A hoarse whisper, a pathetic rasp. "Mom!" No one stirred. The figure took a step forward. I tried again, the scream bubbling from my chest in desperation. "Mom!" This time, the sound came out, raw and trembling. My mother gasped awake, her bleary eyes locking onto mine as I pointed to the creature. But when she turned her gaze to where it had stood, there was nothing. Only shadows. Only a jacket hanging limply on the closet door. My family brushed it off, dismissed it as the feverish nightmare of an overactive imagination. But I knew better. And in the morning, my sister confirmed my fears. She had seen something too. A dark figure, pacing in slow, deliberate circles around us while we slept. She had been frozen, unable to move, but she had heard something, a whisper, a warning from our mother, telling her not to stir. When we confronted my mother, she paled. She confessed she had dreamt of drowning, of being pulled under by unseen hands, yet she never sank. When she awoke, her skin was damp, the sheets cold and clammy beneath her. That night, we had all experienced something beyond reason, beyond explanation. But by the time the morning sun bled into the sky, it was as if the horrors of the night had never existed. Or maybe they still did. Maybe they were just waiting for the next time the lights went out. The next few nights were worse. The feeling of being watched never faded, even in broad daylight. My aunt's house seemed to breathe, the walls closing in as if they were listening. Shadows stretched where they shouldn't, and the air carried a scent of something rotten just beneath the surface of perception. My family went about their days, pretending nothing was wrong, but I saw it in their eyes. They knew. We all knew. I refused to sleep alone. I barely slept at all. Each time I drifted off, I'd wake up gasping, as if something had been pressing down on my chest. My body ached with exhaustion, but every time I closed my eyes, I felt it. It was still there, watching, waiting. Then came the whispers. At first, they were faint, almost indistinguishable from the rustling wind. But soon, they became clearer. Low murmurs seeping from the corners of the room, curling into my ears like venom. I couldn't make out the words, but the intent was clear, malicious, mocking. One night, as I lay on the floor beside my sister, I heard my name. A voice, hollow and distant, called to me. Ethan. My breath hitched. I turned, expecting to see my sister shifting in her sleep. But she was still, her face twisted in discomfort. The voice came again, closer now. Ethan, come. I couldn't move. Every muscle locked in place. My throat was dry, my hands trembling. The room felt colder, the air heavy like something unseen had settled over me. I could feel a presence by the doorway, its form barely distinguishable in the dim moonlight. Then the door creaked open, just a sliver. I squeezed my eyes shut, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might stop. A silence followed, stretching impossibly long. When I dared to open my eyes again, the door was wide open, leading into the pitch-black hallway. Something was standing there. It had no shape, just darkness upon darkness, shifting like smoke yet solid. I couldn't breathe. I knew it was staring at me, even though it had no eyes. The longer I looked, the heavier my body became, sinking into the floor. It was pulling me in, draining the life from me. Then my mother gasped awake. The moment she moved, the figure vanished. The suffocating weight lifted, and air rushed into my lungs. I sat up, gasping, sweat soaking through my clothes. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, voice shaking. She only looked at me, and in the dark, I could see the fear in her expression. She had heard it too. The following day, my mother barely spoke. She moved through the house with a distant look, her hands trembling when she thought no one was watching. I wanted to ask her what she had heard, what she had seen, but the words wouldn't come. Some part of me knew that voicing it would make it too real. That night, I refused to sleep. I lay in bed with my eyes fixed on the door, my breath slow and measured. My sister slept beside me, her breathing deep and even, but my mother? She was awake, too. I could hear her shifting under the blankets, restless. The whispers returned. This time, they weren't quiet. They coiled around me, winding through the darkness like unseen serpents, hissing my name over and over. I squeezed my eyes shut, forcing myself to stay still, but the air grew thick, suffocating. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. Then, something changed. The whispers stopped all at once, replaced by a slow, rhythmic creaking. It came from the hallway, just beyond the door. I didn't want to look, but I had to. I turned my head slightly, just enough to see the sliver of the hallway beyond the open door. My breath hitched in my throat. A figure stood there. It was different this time. No longer a shifting shadow but something more defined. A woman, or what had once been a woman. Her body was impossibly thin, her skin stretched too tightly over her bones. Her face was pale, her mouth twisted in an unnatural grin. Long black hair cascaded over her shoulders, the ends moving as if caught in an invisible current. She lifted a hand, her fingers unnaturally long and claw-like. And then she moved. Not walking. Gliding. Straight toward me. I wanted to scream, to bolt upright, but my body wouldn't obey. I was frozen, paralyzed as she drew closer. The air grew colder with every inch she closed between us, her form flickering like a candle about to be snuffed out. Then, she leaned down, her face inches from mine. Her breath smelled of decay, her grin widening to an impossible degree. "Ethan," she whispered. A scream finally tore from my throat. My mother shot up beside me, her eyes wild with terror. The figure was gone. The room was still. But I knew, she had been there. And she wasn't finished with me yet. The next morning, I knew something had changed. The air in the house felt heavier, oppressive. My mother's face was pale, dark circles under her eyes. She had seen it, too, even if she refused to admit it. We needed to leave. I could feel it in my bones. But my aunt insisted we stay, brushing off our fears with nervous laughter. "You're all just exhausted," she said. "The mind plays tricks in the dark." But I knew better. That night, the house itself seemed to breathe. The walls pulsed as if something alive lurked beneath them, and the shadows twisted unnaturally, stretching toward me. I refused to close my eyes. Every muscle in my body tensed as I listened to the silence, waiting. Then, a sound. A long, dragging scrape against the floorboards. I turned my head slowly, my heart hammering. The hallway stretched into darkness, but at its end, a figure crouched low. The woman. Her head twitched unnaturally, her grin wider than before, splitting her face like a wound. Her fingers tapped against the wooden floor, sharp and deliberate. I tried to move, but I was paralyzed, the same suffocating force pressing down on me. She began crawling toward me, her movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet with severed strings. My mother gasped beside me, finally seeing what I had been seeing all along. She grabbed my arm and whispered a prayer under her breath, her voice shaking. The woman stopped. For a moment, everything was silent. Then, with a blood-curdling shriek, she vanished into a swirl of shadows, retreating into the darkness of the house. My mother didn't hesitate. She shook my sister awake, grabbed our things, and we ran. My aunt called after us, confused, but we didn't stop. We didn't look back. By the time the sun rose, we were miles away, safe, or so we thought. That night, as I lay in my own bed, exhaustion overtaking me, I heard it one last time. A whisper. "Ethan." And then, silence.